This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Claudia Wedepol, the archivist of the Warburg Institute, for those who don't know me. It's very great pleasure to see such a big audience here tonight. As you can see from the screen, David had been planning to give this talk to the Warburg Institute, to fellows, colleagues, staff, students at the Warburg Institute, but now it has clearly grown into something much bigger. And I know he's delighted about it. So we will just immediately welcome him to take over this lectern. And I know there's going to be some space for a discussion after his talk. David.
Thank you. It's good to see all of you here. I have to confess that I'm a little frightened because Claudia actually knows more about Warburg than most other people in this room. When I say she knows more about Warburg than most other people in this room, it's not only because she's smart, but it is also because she has found so much new, and so much new has been found under her aegis in the archives over the last decade or so. So, I'm going to try not to be too frightened as we go along. I think we can have let me find the, good. Andrew, do you think we should drop these blinds so that people can see this, or can you see the image sufficiently from the back? It's good, okay. What does this man in tatters with red eyes and holding the end of a frayed rope have to do with the future of the humanities? Or this picturesque nymph who reminds us of the taste of our grandmothers as she strides so gracefully towards the birth of St. John the Baptist in a prosperous Florentine bedchamber. Or Albrecht Dürer's great drawing of Orpheus, the first sodomite, as the banderole in the tree reminds us, being beaten to death by the angry women of Thrace. There's much more to them than the beautiful instantiations of the views of Jacob Burckhardt on the art of the Renaissance, or of the transmission of antique forms from Italy to Northern Europe at the end of the 15th century. In the hands of A.B. Warburg, they pointed to the future. So I'll go back to the man in tatters. So I'm afraid I confess that I'm going to break one of my cardinal rules today, and you'll be dismayed. And that rule was never to talk more than 55 minutes. Unless I manage to cut more than I think I will, I'll talk for about 5 minutes over the hour, unforgivable. But I console myself, and I hope you too, with the fact that when A.B. Warburg himself lectured, he rarely did so for less than 2 hours at a throw, and sometimes even 3. I'll spare you that. All the more reason then for me to condense his main essays as best I can. To those of you who know them well, and there are many here who know them well, I apologize. But what I found is that outside a small group of experts, even within the Institute I now have the privilege to run, both the details and the extraordinary conclusions Warburg derived from them are not as well known as they ought to be. Indeed, they often seem to have escaped the net of memory, of Mnemosyne, the very watchword of the Institute. What has always been remembered, however, is the idea of the Nachleben der Antike, the afterlife of antiquity, and only slightly less that of the pathos formal, the formulaic expression of emotion through gesture. But since the most distinguished of the Institute's post-Warburg directors, Ernst Gombrich, had himself steered away from both pathos and empathy, even these were pretty much suppressed. The Nachleben der Antike, as I've said often in the last few months, was conceived of almost entirely in terms of the Nach and hardly at all in terms of the Leben. What Warburg intended was the life of images across time, and this should have been the core of the Warburgian project. In all its official and promotional materials, the chief aim of the Institute has long been described as the survival of the classics, and of the European classics in particular. It exists principally for the study of the classical tradition. The theme this is how it goes in all our brochures until this year, which unifies the history of Western civilization, say all the public statements and reports. But Warburg went further and saw ancient forms, and not only the classical antique, as a source of the polarizing energies that drive the transmission of cultural forms across time and space. Warburg's project was vast, complex, and imaginative. To understand it, one must know his writings, both published and now finally emerging from the Institute's archives. His prose is rich and evocative, and even as he wanders the globe from topic to topic, the depth into which he enters is often impenetrable. It can be a difficult task, because Warburg himself, in his famous search for der lieber Gott im Detail, often went into maddening obscurity. But it is precisely this that seems to have prevented so many of his epiphanies from seeing the critical implications of his work as they emerge into the light. Warburg started with the great works of the Renaissance and swiftly went on to develop forms of a discipline that have yet to be appreciated. Today, I will concentrate on what seem to me the four main areas of his work. His psychology was more complex, his anthropology wider, his political commitment more original and radical, his biology far more reaching than anything that Burckhardt could have imagined. He took art history in directions it had never gone before and made it part of a broadly conceived cultural history and theory. For him, the history of art had not just to do with works of art or of aestheticizing responses to it, but was constituted by the entire history of images and image making. He made unheard of connections between low art and high, between simple popular imagery and the art of the Renaissance, between superstition and reason, between cultural conflict and ecumenical resolution, between monstrosity and normative logic. He recognized the constructive tensions between energy and rest, disequilibrium and balance, immediate empathetic engagement and detachment, between the ever greater speed of image transmission in modern culture and the need for what he called Denkraum, space for contemplation. He anticipated a future rapprochement, a Brückenbau, a bridge building between science and the humanities that has still not been truly achieved. He pioneered a truly radical form of Kulturwissenschaft, whose main elements I will try to parse this evening and show to be indispensable for the future of the humanities. So on the 9th of August 1909, A.B. Warburg wrote to his cousin Adolf Goldschmidt in Berlin. "My dear Adolf," he began, who was to become a famous art historian in his own right. "My dear Adolf," he began, "the theme of the Lehrter Bahnhof, that little railway station between Hamburg and Hanover, has never ceased to occupy me. Modern art history," he says, "comes from various different directions, which are not organically or self-evidently coherent." I've tried to break down his complicated German for the sake of the London audience into slightly less complex phrases. I won't always succeed. Then he went on to describe these different directions very precisely and accompanied them with a typically complex Warburgian diagram. Oh well, this is unfortunate because nobody will be able to see this at the back. But it's a very sprawling diagram which shows the various routes that he imagined this train would take from the Lehrter Bahnhof. In fact, this is actually a schematic diagram from Tremmel and Weigel's Gesammelte the edition of the collected works, but this is what it really looks in the document in the archives. It's a mess. But so you don't have to see it. He's making this diagram. There are lots of these in the archives. But so the point is, he describes these different directions quite precisely. So, for example, Route A1, Mirabilia, including pilgrimages, Heiltums literature, and so on. A2, panegyrical hero worship. B, history of artists, genius, techniques, etc. That's how he sort of divides them up in a slightly ad hoc way. C, ideal forms, and so on. Here and there he names the representatives of each field. He's thinking with his hand in paper. Vasari, Kant, Winkelmann, and then he lumps the He over them, of all people. And then we realize that it's all a bit dense, a bit out of hand. Then comes section 2 and contemporary directions, each by a group of representatives. So, for example, under the Bedingtheiten der Technik, so sort of the limiting conditions of technique, he puts, won't be surprised to hear, Semper, Lange, Vöger, and der kleine Adolfler. He puts his young cousin in there as well. Then he has B, Bedingtheiten durch die Natur des primitiven Menschen, nature of primitive man, and so on. He goes on and on. Stop, we want to say, this is too much. It's definitely not self-evidently organically coherent, as he was seeking to do. He goes on dividing up all these different directions, putting names into categories, but all these categories have several names in them. As I said, Vöger, Semper, Lange in one, and Wölflin and whoever else was doing formal stuff at that time in another. But then there's only one category. I find this very striking. I don't think it's been commented on much. One category, Bedingtheiten durch die Natur des mimischen Menschen, the limitations or the conditions of the man, the mimic or mimetic man. And the only person in that category is Warburg. So Warburg is the guy who is in this self-assigned category, who's going to work on the ability of man to be a mimic, to imitate. The importance of this self-assignment has never been fully acknowledged. Now, of course, I could go off in a whole, those of you who know my work in the sort of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience will know that we could go off in that direction now, but I restrain myself and stay with history for the moment. In the end, the directions, these complexly defined directions, can be more clearly discerned than in the map that he drew to accompany, this terrible map that he drew to accompany his letter. In fact, the journey had already begun by the time he sat down with Goldschmidt on the platform of the Lehrter Bahnhof. The plan this afternoon now is to see where it would go and what kind of station it eventually arrived at. I hope that it doesn't take too long to get there. That actually was a branch line. The Lehrter Bahnhof was on a branch line. So one. So some of this you know, because I'm going to talk about the various stops on the way to the final station. So one, the well-known Botticelli dissertation of 1893. It's apt that we should talk about it in the light of the exhibition now on the V&A, in which we co-sponsored a very successful conference last week. So noting the typically Botticellian use of fluttering drapes over barely concealed moving limbs and the hair flying in the breeze, Warburg recalled the use of these topoi, as most of you know, in the Homeric hymns, the Metamorphoses and the Fasti of Ovid, in the Orfeo and the Giostra of Politian. Fair enough. The antique, as Burckhardt and many others had noted, survived with grace in the Renaissance. It appeared in the Zeffiri Amorosi of Claudian and Ovid, in Poliziano, and in the Birth of Venus, and of course the Primavera. Look at the nymphs more closely. But Warburg remembered that this form of Nachleben was not only a matter of grace, but of orgiastic fury. Recalling the ancient Maenads, whose frenzied movements lay at the basis of the works not only of Botticelli, but of contemporaries like Agostino di Duccio, Warburg, so this is of course San Bernardino in Perugia, Warburg developed two critical terms. That of the Nachleben der Antike, and though it did not explicitly appear in his writings until about 10 years later, the Pathos Formel. The critical writers for the development of these ideas, I know Claudia has some more critical writers to throw in, but we'll stay with the big ones for the moment. The critical writers for the development of these ideas were, of course, Nietzsche, whom Warburg clearly read with great enthusiasm. Time for a Warburg and Nietzsche conference one day. And Robert Fisher, the theorist of Einfühlung, what we now in English call empathy, of course. The Nachleben der Antike was not used not simply in the sense of the survival of ancient forms, but of ancient forms of emotional expression. What the images of Maenads and their derivations made clear was how the outward movements of the body and the agitated, almost transparent drapes that reveal these movements testify to the inner agitation and psychic struggles that lay below them. The apparently casual beiwerk of drapery, the side work of drapery, accessory work of drapery and wind-blown hair, gave the impression, Warburg noted, of heightened life, and Botticelli used these sources to give pictorial form to the movements of the soul. As the prime conveyor of emotion, the body thus formed the basis of what Warburg would seek to define, sort of thing we don't like very much today and therefore have scanted rather too much. So these conveyors of emotion allow the body to form what Warburg would seek to define as the Ursprache of emotional feeling, the speech of emotional feeling and language, and of the Gebärde, the primal gestures of emotion that he would soon be calling Pathosform. No wonder that at the end of the dissertation he noted that the most difficult problem of all in art is that of capturing images of life in motion, das Festhalten der Bilder des bewegten Lebens. 2. He went to the American Southwest to see the dances of the Pueblo peoples in the hopes of enriching his search for the primitive roots of the relationship between movement, emotion, and symbolic efficacy. In studying the salvific and rain-bringing snake dances of the Hopi, great photographs, which you've all seen, I imagine, studying the salvific and rain-bringing snake dances of the Hopi, he found remote yet clear parallels with both the struggle of Apollo and the Python in the Florentine Intermezzi of 1588, which he had just studied, and of the Laocoon itself. Oops, I should have shown you. This, of course, is not a Warburg photo. I hope that's not me. Seeing this photo is actually another photo of the snake dance, which I think, as you know, Warburg himself never saw. Those great photographs are of another dance, which he saw later on in Orange. Seeing these wild and ancient dances allowed him to formulate his sense not just of the dramatic effectiveness of movement, but of its magical and therapeutic power, its ability to bring rain, which always ensued, as you know, after the snake dance. It is amazing. I don't know how many of you have been to any of the Pueblo dances, but they work. The rain always comes at the end of the dance. Its transformative powers, one could say. After all, it was this turn to an explicit anthropologizing of art history that emerges in his famous lecture on the snake dance and brought about his release from the last prison of madness in Kreuzlingen 6 years before his death in Rome in September 1929. In the great essay on Dürer and antiquity of 1905, Warburg once more took up the problem of the Urformen, the primal forms of the expression of emotion through gesture, comparing the defensive gesture of Orpheus against the wild and aggressive beatings of the Maenadic women of Thrace with the almost identical ancient one on ancient sculpture and vases. Actually, I'm glad that we have the Laocoon just below. That's the old Laocoon. So what's so interesting here is when you look at this and you, for example, look at the defensive gesture of Orpheus, and you see how it's derived. Well, you see, it's derived from the good Laocoon, the pre-Restoration Laocoon. So further justification for the correctness of that gesture of defense, which appears here in the 6th century vase, and then again in the stele. You see, I think I have, and this is sort of the wild women of Thrace, of course, look a bit like the famous Pompeian mural of the death of Orpheus. Seeing these wild and ancient dances allowed him to formulate, you could see the connection between the Laocoon and the Hopi dances, and this may move forward here. But comparing this defensive gesture of Orpheus not only with the almost identical one on these ancient sculptures and vases, he traced the ways in which Dürer had adapted these forms via tarot cards, popular book illustrations, as here of the story in Ovid. So it's practically the same as that, and that even more popular rudimentary woodcut. And also in the recent engravings of Mantegna and Pollaiuolo. So you see him here ranging from high to low and from low to high in his search for the origins of these gestures in the great drawing by Dürer. For Warburg, it was images such as these that brought the profound changes in Dürer's art from its Gothic constraints and released them as if through the safety valve of emotional expression and figuration both high and low, in the great works of his maturity. I mean, it is very interesting, those of you who know Dürer, he is wooden before he comes to terms with this kind of, before he absorbs these illustrations and engravings, the engravings of Mantegna and Pollaiuolo. It was clear from then on that the question of the pathos formal, as it is still too often forgotten, was not just the handing down of a particular physical motif, but a manifestation of a biological correlation between outward movement and inner expression. And in the indispensable edition of Warburg's work, Tremmel and Weigel pointed out that the concept of the pathos formal was the central one in Warburg's thought that made possible the transition from a style historical approach to a cultural, as he called, kulturwissenschaftlicher way of seeing, a cultural scientific way of seeing. I'd love to agree with this, but in fact, there are several more competitors for this critical factor in the transition from style history to cultural history. 4. The Nympha. I won't say much about the Nympha because it's a topic which has been much written about. Warburg went back to Florence the year after his return from New Mexico. Following his studies of the bewegte Beiwerk, the moving accessory work in Botticelli, it was natural enough for him to want to further study figures such as the serving maid who enters the lying-in room of Elizabeth and her newly born son, John the Baptist, whom Ghirlandaio had painted in the Tornabuoni chapel in Santa Maria Novella in Florence in the late 1480s. She too, in a swift movement and flying drapery, embodies the afterlife of the Maenad, but here she shows no vindictive fury, only restrained, though still eager, grace. She is a Maenad tamed. This inner polarity, the seeming constraint on emotion, is what drove the seductive fascination that she held for both Warburg and the Dutch historian André Jolles, with whom he planned to write a book on the Nympha. But he soon abandoned the project, deciding that the way Jolles conceived of it was too aestheticizing and insufficiently social historical. He wished to enter into the dramas of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Pazzi conspiracy, and Savonarola. He wanted to understand the relationship between the great banking families, which he, of course, was a famous scion, of Florence, the Medici, the Tornabuoni, the Sassetti, Portinari, and Tani, and to examine the economic and artistic exchanges between Flanders, France, and Italy. He had begun to see both the connections and the dialectical tensions up and down, socially, artistically, morally, and spiritually. 5. Lifelikeliness. He turned to what might seem to be the exact opposite of the Nympha, the unadornedly lifelike portraits in the chapels of Giovanni Tornabuoni and Francesco Sassetti in Santa Trinita, both banking colleagues and friends of Lorenzo. There is Sassetti, and there's Lorenzo in the middle next to Sassetti himself. Now this lifelikeness he connected with two factors. One, the aborti, the votive images that hung in such abundance and with such necessary votive lifelikeness in Santissima Annunziata, and most of which unfortunately have now been lost, so I just content myself with reminding you, you can see Lorenzo in the full height of his powers, and there is of course the death mask, also would have served votive purposes of Lorenzo, and I show you, because we don't remember this often enough, the very great votive head of Henry VII in Westminster Abbey. So they stand in here for the aborti and lifelikeness. And secondly, in a reversal of the indebtedness of Dürer to the Italians, he pointed out the high realism of the northern paintings, the panni and those cloths and tapestries that were then beginning to inundate Florence. So here is one of these extraordinary tapestries which he talked about in the famous essay. You won't be able to see, but these are really robust locals with very vivid faces as they cut the logs and drink refreshment at the back, and here use the axe and so on. But if you could see, there were these faces even on the tapestries which came from the north to adorn the rich houses of Florence, Palazzi of Florence, have an extraordinary lifelikeness, which obviously marked the approach of Ghirlandaio to portraiture, as Warburg suggested. So this is not a comparison that is often made, but it's the Van der Pale Madonna, the Canon Van der Pale, almost a little earlier, of course, 40 years earlier, of Jan van Eyck in Bruges. I just set it beside the picture of Sassetti in the chapel himself. I remind you, of course, that this is very shortly after the arrival of Hugo van der Goes's great Portinari altarpiece in Florence as well. These were the influences that affected this tendency towards the high realism in the two chapels in Santa Maria Novella, the portraiture in the chapels in Santa Maria Novella and Santa Trinita in Florence. But there was much more to this extension of high art history to its roots in popular imagery. 6 imprese, fortune and morality. So I would have, as I think about the length of this paper, I thought, well, I'm going to cut out the bit on the Last Will and Testament of Francesco Sassetti, but it's irresistible, so I'm going to put it in if you allow me. So when he found the Last Will and Testament of Sassetti in the Florentine archives, he struck art historical and cultural historical, as well as moral and human gold. He tells his son to do as they will with his estate, I'm quoting, in such a way as to incur no blame or reproach, and to live harmonious lives and at peace with each other. Where fortune intend us to make landfall, he says, I know not. Wherever fortune carries his sons, they must not refuse the inheritance, even if it contains debt, and live and die in the same state of fortune, for this is their duty. And then he concludes, Mitia sint fata mi, may the fates be gentle to me. Warburg now compares the tensions between traditional Christian and medieval attitudes towards the acceptance of fate, on the one hand, and the newfound freedom of the Renaissance, infused and inspired by pagan values to resist her blows, on the other. So it's this tension between Stoic acceptance and resistance, something we can all identify in the face of the fickleness of fortune. It's a sudden and typical intellectual leap of Warburg's as he works to sustain this dialectic of resignation and resistance. It's stoical and Christian, but also active and ready to move, to seize fortune's lock as she moves inexorably on. Typically, Warburg derives his evidence from high moral philosophy on the one hand and popular imagery on the other. He starts with the impresa, the popular image, the conveyor not of dense, but of schematic and compact semiosis. You won't be able to see, but of course, right at the top is fortune at the sail of a boat being carried along by the tempest and the winds. Of course, fortuna is also Italian for the tempest. The emblem, this is the emblem placed above the door of the palace of Sassetti's friend Giovanni Rucellai, showing a ship with a full wind in its sails, a symbol of energy in the antique vein. In Italian, fortuna, as I mentioned, not only means chance or wealth, but also storm wind. What can human reason and intelligence do against fortuna audax, which blows you this way and that, velis nolis ve, whether you like it or not? How much do you allow yourself to be battered about, or to seek to control for bold fortune? Then he takes a previously undescribed engraving, which he noticed the same wind-tossed boat, with Bernardo Rucellai standing at the mast and his wife Nanina at the tiller. Its motto reads, Mi lascio portar dalla fortuna al fin di aver buona fortuna. I let myself be carried away by the storm winds in order to have good fortune. And then, as aware as ever of the polarities of action and resignation, Warburg quoted the words of Rucellai's friend, the great Renaissance philosopher Marsilio Ficino. It is good to do battle with fortune, wielding the weapons of foresight, patience, and ambition, but it is even better to withdraw and to shun such a combat from which so few emerge victorious. It's better to make peace with fortune, to prevent her from resorting to force. Also, das Ficino. All this we shall do if we can combine within ourselves the might, the wisdom, and the will. Finis, amen. That's so, he says, suck it up is basically what Ficino is saying. Accept your fate. So, to submit to fortune or to grab her by the forelock. Christian and Stoic acceptance or the powerful action of the hero and condottiere, the figure that so fascinated Warburg and which he finds expressed with such bodily forcefulness in the 1557 medal of Camillo Agrippa with the motto again of Velis Noliste. The only way out of this is to grab fortune by the hair. So this is sort of an amazing thing you won't be able to see. So you have naked fortune here with her long locks being pulled backwards by the figure of the condottiere. So there is the other option of grabbing the fortune by the forelock and pulling her back. So, here's a very high art equivalent of fortune in Peruzzi's, by Peruzzi in the Farnesina. It's the high pole, represented as so often in Warburg by Agostino Chigi, who commissioned this against the popular culture of the imprese and soon, of course, of astrology. In the end, you must act and overwhelm fortune by sheer physical force. And it's very interesting that Warburg never cites that famous passage in Machiavelli, or the passage in Machiavelli, which is perhaps the most famous one of all. You remember it. It's very, very maschilista, as one would say, a male chauvinist, in which he says, remember that, perché la fortuna è donna, è necessaria, volendola tenere sotto, batterla e buttarla. So, you've got to keep her down and smack her. That's what he says. It's a woman. You have to keep her down and smack her to keep her under control. But Warburg was too tactful. He must have known this passage, to quote Machiavelli. Even so, all this is a fitting motto for the bankers of Florence. Protected by the youthful and impetuous David, as you know the role of David in Florence with his sling. Indeed, this is the figure from the Bible who also appears in front of the Sassetti chapel, but at the same time, of course, these slings are associated with the centaurs of antiquity. You see, Warburg is building everything together to come to extraordinary conclusion through density of information and to plumb into the details of things. So, for example, what you can't see from this, I'm afraid, here's the great tomb of Francesco Sassetti, the great black marble tomb, but below, well, I wish you could see here, are in fact two centaurs with their slings. So what, and of course the slings are associated with David as well, the great protector of Florence. Then again, Warburg sees in the bookplate to Sassetti's own copy of a translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, beautiful bookplate. And here too, you have these centaurs, the centaurs with slings, held by them down below, and of course, he says, "À mon pouvoir" is his motto, within my power. So he's got the slings associate with David and the wildness of the centaur. So it's à mon pouvoir, which is often compared in the text of the Nicomachean Ethics with a more passive one of Metia sint fata mihi. So it unites with those wild symbols from pagan antiquity. But what Warburg describes them as is ein Sinnbild bewusster Energie Entfaltung, a symbol of conscious unfolding of energy. This is very important. David Brett translated as a symbol of conscious energy, but for Warburg it's always a matter of the unfolding of energy, which, this is what is critical for him. The importation of what remains wild in the classical past lies at the heart of Warburg's theory of cultural transmission. And it is precisely this dichotomy that plays itself out finally and with heartrending beauty in the paintings and sculptures for the funerary chapel of Sassetti and his wife in Santa Trinita. That opposition is also in the chapel of the altarpiece of the chapel itself, where you have these rustic shepherds. Oops. Now there you have the rustic shepherds, taken completely from the rustic shepherd, just a few years early, of the Portinari altarpiece. So the Flemings, these are Flemish heads. He wants to show the wildness and the rusticity that lies behind the high art represented by that sarcophagus, before which, of course, the infant Jesus lies. In their emblematic imagery, therefore, both Sassetti and Rucellai reveal, this is Warburg, how in that upheaval of the subjective they aspire to a new balance of energies. They face the world with a heightened assurance founded on two still compatible forms of memory, Christian ascetic and antique heroic. And yet they were still aware that individual human strength was pitted against the mysterious and arbitrary decrees of fate. So this is a typical Warburgian passage in which he begins with a tiny symbolic image and ends with a reflection on the balance of opposing energies that sustains memory in the service of the world and of culture in the best sense, that of leading a better and more sustainable life. But this is nothing besides what comes next. 7. International astrology. Having transformed traditional aesthetic, stylistic, and even iconographic approaches to Renaissance art into dimensions of biological, political, and moral inquiry, Warburg then further anthropologized his approach into a new and global dimension that still has major potential in terms of present international conflicts. Their meticulous antiquarianism continues to be of significance even now. Perhaps the most important of the essays I mentioned earlier as contributing to Warburg's move from style and art history to a truly broad and global cultural history is the one on Palazzo Schifanoia. That its frescoes are no longer puzzling is entirely due to his concern with the relations between Arabic and Western astrology and mathematics, as set out in the works of Franz Boll, which he never could cease to consult and admire. A great part, it's important for Warburg, is going to leave it up, but he comments that a great part of what is commonly known as superstition springs from a misapplication of mathematics, for which reason the name of mathematician was formerly equated with that of a charlatan or an astrologer. So this is the background to his work on the basic on the iconography of the frescoes commissioned by Duke Borso d'Este of Ferrara from the relatively unknown Francesco del Costa and his fellow Ferrarese paintings in the 1460s. And the basic iconography was clear enough. So you won't see this, alas. You really need a big round room here in which you can all see the pictures. So here's the great tripartite wall, and above you have the personification of the months, and below you have the deeds of Borso d'Este, and of course along with the, along with the personifications of the months, this is March, so it's Athena, and here is the activities, whatever one does in March. I can barely see myself. And then there was this mystery of these three figures in the middle row. What on earth were they? No one knew, let alone the bold and mysterious figure with which this lecture began. So most of you know this, but it's worth going through it again. Basing himself on Boll's monumental reconstruction of the text known as the Sphaera Barbarica, here I'm treading on the toes of the school, as it were, of my distinguished colleague Charles Burnett. So you'll find plenty of things to worry about in what I say and what Warburg said. But anyway, basing himself on Boll's monumental reconstruction of the text known as the Sphaera Barbarica, compiled by a certain Tusar in the first centuries of the Christian era, he figured out what they were. The Sphaera Barbarica was 3 times longer than the standard map of the stars fixed by Aratus's astronomical treatise of around 300 BC. But this, as Warburg puts it, was insufficient to supply enough hieroglyphs of fate, he's always worrying about fate, for the daily predictive needs of Hellenistic astrology. Hence the 36 decans, 3 to each zodiacal sign, that appeared in Palazzo Schifanoia. So the decans are these 3 figures which each zodiacal sign was divided into. Bohl showed the earlier roots of this decanic doctrine. So this man is one of these decans. He showed the earlier roots of this decanic doctrine in Babylonian, Egyptian, Indian and Anatolian astrology, and demonstrated how these came together in the 9th century Introductorium Maius of Abu Mazar, before being translated in the 12th century in Spain by Ibn Ezra, passing there via a 13th century French translation by a Jew called Hagin, into the Astrolabium Magnum of Pietro d'Abano, the Faust of 14th century Padua, and first published by Ratdolt in Augsburg in 1488, and reprinted again and again. So this is a truly global art history. We were global before the term became fashionable. 4 years ago, he writes, when I read Abu Mashar's text, I was suddenly put in mind of those mysterious figures in Ferrara, so often and so vainly scrutinized for so many years, and lo and behold, they reveal themselves one after the other as the Indian decans of Abu Mashar. The entire astral system of the Middle Register can now be analyzed with certainty. The firmament, as described by the Greeks, was the base stratum on which the Egyptian cult system of the decans, the subdivision of astrological signs that ruled over every individual life, was established. This in turn was overlaid by a layer of Indian mythological adaptations before finding its way, probably by way of Persia, into Arab culture, and then finally through Spain and France to the monumental cosmology of the Italian Renaissance. It was an amazing performance. Monsters lay at the basis of the order of a great Renaissance work of art. An Indian astrological image transmitted through Persia and a 9th century Arabic scholar and so on, I recited that, finally found its way to the walls of a Renaissance palace. Warburg had indeed come far from the more cheerful view of the Renaissance as the carefree pursuit of sensuous classical beauty. And the man with the bloodshot eyes, tattered clothes and the frayed rope, he was an inventive combination of a whole variety of representations of the first decan of Aries, as shown in the extraordinary illustrations to a huge variety of works, in which forms I show you these Arabic treatises, see, obviously with Indian influence, of the decan of Aries. There's the ram right in the middle, with the sword over the shoulder, also down below on the right. There again, the sword on the shoulder, the dripping head of a monster, which of course reminds you of, well, I want to say something, let me see if I can pull this together. You can see this frayed cord, which is obviously a recollection of the bits of hair that come out of the chopped off neck there, you see, the blood. So this was the theory. So here it's again, you could see that. But also the raised sword and the head, of course, puts you in mind, this is much earlier than Leiden Aratus of the 8th century. So these are all connected together. Here in a 15th century woodcut manuscript you have the decan there, also with the sword, lost the head. And then again you see Perseus back in the Farnesina, and then Othello. But you see the description reads as follows. The description in the 6th century Indian astronomer and philosopher Varamihira was Abu Mashar's unacknowledged source. The first Rakana of Aries is a man with a white cloth tied round his loins, black, facing a person as if able to protect him, of fearful appearance and of red eyes, and holding an axe in his hand and his arm. Well, he's not got an axe in his hand, but for the rest, this is clearly the decan, the first decan of Aries. So in these early, so we see here the long etiology of these images. You can see also, as I've just shown you, how the orientalizing sort of beard in these figures and the hair dripping from the neck can turn into the frayed rope. Just as in Varamihira, this fierce black man is a powerful stature and is shown in a voluminous white garment tied round his midriff with a cord, wrathful and erect, guarding and observing. Look how these figures pop up in Ferrara of all places. And then he goes into the whole astrological material associated with the struggle to reconcile the astrology of the stars and mathematics. He goes to esoteric objects like the Sphaeram Bianchini, strange tablet in the Louvre which has a calf-headed Isis and holding out here a statuette like that. This is Warburg's drawing of a figure from the Sphaeram Bianchini, and to him this figure of Isis holding out an infant provides yet further evidence of the long transition from paganism to Christianity. So you read this and you think to yourself, well, he's going a bit far here. But there's something compelling about this long percorso, this long journey from ancient Babylon up to the Renaissance. So per Monstra ad Sphaeram, Warburg concluded with Bohr, through monsters to the harmony of the spheres. And we still have, so there's another, here's the strange calf-headed Isis, whoops, here, which you can't see, holding a child just like a Madonna and child. So we go from the monstrosities of ancient and barbaric astrology to the mathematical perfection of the spheres. It was these tensions we'll come back to Giordano Bruno in a moment. It all seems far-fetched, yet the ambition is clear and the learning breathtaking. Where would it go? Commilitonen, says, fellow students. The lecture on Palazzo Schifanoia concludes. I try to get something military out of this term commilitonen, but Claudia assures me that it's just the German word for fellow students. So fellow students, he says. I need hardly say that this lecture has not been about solving a pictorial riddle for its own sake. It has not been about solving a pictorial riddle for its own sake. It isolated a highly provisional experiment. Note the language. The highly provisional experiment that I have undertaken here, which is intended as a plea for an extension of the methodological borders of our study of art. Until now, a lack of adequate general evolutionary categories has impeded art history in placing its materials at the disposal of the still unwritten historical psychology of human expression. That's what is really driving Warburg for much of this psychology of human expression. By adopting either an unduly materialistic or an unduly mystical stance, says Warburg, our young discipline blocks its own panoramic view of history. It gropes towards an evolutionary theory of its own. He was always influenced by Darwin and read him carefully. In attempting to elucidate the frescoes in the Palazzo Schifanoia, I hope to have shown how the iconological analysis can range freely without fear of border guards. No border guards between disciplines. We know about them. And can treat the ancient, medieval and modern worlds as a coherent historical unity, an analysis that can scrutinize the purest and most utilitarian of arts as equivalent documents of expression. How such a method, by taking pains to illuminate a single obscurity, can cast light on great and universal evolutionary processes in all their interconnectedness. I've not tried, he admits, to find a neat solution, so much as to present a new problem which I would like to formulate as follows. How far can the stylistic shift in the presentation of human beings in Italian art be regarded as an international process of dialectical engagement with the surviving imagery of Eastern Europe, Mediterranean, pagan culture? Enthusiasts, he goes on, wonder at the inexplicable fact of supreme artistic achievement. That's what enthusiasts worry about. But this can only be enhanced by the awareness that genius is both a gift of grace and a conscious dialectical energy, eine bewusste Auseinanderenergie. It was with this desire to restore the ancient world that the good European began his battle for enlightenment in that age of internationally migrating images, as as we think of our Bilderfahrzeuge group, internationally migrating images, that we a shade too mystically call the age of the Renaissance. So Warburg saw himself as engaged in Brückenbau, bridge building in both senses, across disciplines and across cultures. From the beginning, he was avowedly dialectical, preferring not to use that word, but rather to speak of the more generously open Auseinandersetzung, the exchange of ideas that underlie the dialectical tensions that Warburg was so constantly revealing. So 10, I'm going to cut out a bit now. Politics and peace. And this revolves around the crisis brought upon Warburg, from which he never really recovered, of Italy's forming an alliance, breaking away from Germany in 1915 to form an alliance with Britain. This was a terrible shock, obviously, for Warburg, this divorce between Germany and the land, not only what is schön and Zitronenböen, but of Mailand and of Botticelli. And it was from this situation that Warburg extracted the relevance of his work to the political situation of his times. Still working under the influence of Boll, he looked at the effect of superstitious astrology in the remarkable essay of 1917 entitled Heidnisch antike Weissagung in Wort und Bild in Luther's Zeiten, pagan antique prophecy in the word and image in Luther's time. So, it was provoked a little bit by the appearance of the comet, Halley's comet, and the way in which it was perceived by Melanchthon, Luther, and their opponents. The Catholics saw it as doom for the reformers. Melanchthon wavered, but basically took it seriously. Luther, Sidney Angler said, "Are there going to be many jokes in your lecture?" I said, not many jokes, but at least Luther had a sense of humor for once when he was talking of the astrologers, and he said, "Es ist ein Dreck mit ihrer Kunst." It's your art is a piece of shit, he said about the astrologers, and referred to der heillosen und schäbigten Astrologia. So from this, Warburg extracted an extraordinary lesson, which I won't go through in so much detail, but what he really was concerned with was the tension between sort of superstitious practices and barbarism, which he saw as underlying the great European struggle of the First War. So in this essay on Luther and the relationship between the survival of ancient astrological beliefs and the crisis of the Reformation, Warburg made it clear that the images it examines falls within the scope of the history of art in the widest sense, insofar as that term covers image making in all its forms. He's insisting again on image making in all its forms. One shouldn't be content with a classically rarefied version of art history offered by Winkelmann, because the Olympian aspect of antiquity had first to be wrested from its entrenched traditional daimonic aspect. And then, after more discussion of these tensions, Warburg reaches his conclusion. No one could have put it more graphically and epigrammatically than he, in an extraordinarily concentrated yet utterly typical passage that runs, "The revival of the demonic antique completes itself, as we have seen, by a kind of polar function of empathetic image memory. We are in the age of Faust, where the modern scientist, caught between magical practice and cosmological mathematics, seeks to achieve a space for reflection, the Denkraum der Besonnenheit, between himself and the object." Then the famous statement, "Athens always wants to be reconquered anew from Alexandria." So the locus of rationality always wants to be reconquered anew from the locus of wildness, out there, the exotic other. So he here set out the three critical obsessions of his last year: the polar function of empathetic image memory, polare Funktion des einfühlenden Bildgedächtnisses, the space for contemplation and Athens always wants to be reconquered anew by Alexandria. It wants to do that. So the last stop's on the way to the final station. He works on Mane. He shows the derivation of those figures, as you know, from antique sarcophagi, reclining river god here at the bottom. This figure, that figure. But we won't go into that. It shows the adaptations and modifications reappearing in Raphael. He discusses the significance of this recline, reflects on memory, body, and tension. He works on Rembrandt finally and dies in Rome. For the Rembrandt project, he prepared the first version of the Builder Atlas. The famous Builder Atlas, the culminating project, still misunderstood, but providing in its theoretical preparation, if not in its actual execution, the material for the final reconciliations. I wish I could spend time on the Builder Atlas, because it is one of the legendary projects on which much of Warburg's fame rests. More than any other Warburgian project, it has acquired a reputation as the ultimate resource for the understanding of the transmission of images of all kinds, from antiquity to modernity. But it was never intended as merely an encyclopedia of images. It was intended to show the logic of how the polarities and tensions of superstition and logic, of cultural similarity and difference, of insinuation of high into low, of disorder into order, of the barbaric into the civilized, drove images across time and space and gave the engines of their transmission their profound energies. So, again, if I weren't wanting to rush to what I think is an important conclusion, I want to skip my section here on the ways in which Warburg's theory of memory was derived from Richard Seemon's complex theory of the engram, sort of anticipating with vastly more seriousness current notions about the meme and so on. How do cultural forms repeat themselves through the physical movements and expressions of the body across many, many epochs? It is in the zone, he says, of orgiastic mass seizures that we must look for the mint which stamps upon the memory the expressive movements of the extreme transports of emotion as far as they can be translated into gesture language with such intensity that these engrams of the experience of suffering passion survive as a heritage in the memory. So you get the idea. I mean, these are great topics which need to be explored even more than they have been so far. So the Builder Atlas leads us back into anthropology and the basic principles of Warburg's thought. He gave these extraordinary lectures and talks at the end of his life, the panels in which the talks he gave when the panels were first displayed, his lectures in honor in 1925 of the recently deceased Ball, the question of orientation, and he welcomed his small audience at the Ball lecture in the name of cultural science that must challenge European intellectual history on image psychological principles. He insisted on working on the obscure translations of Aramihira of Al-Mumasra to help achieve the massive bridge building entailed by the, it's getting big here, the unwritten pragmatic universal history of the human spirit. It all sounds pretty cumbersome in English, and it was in German too, but the aim and the ambition were clear. So on New Year's Eve of 1927, Warburg spoke to his four brothers, the core of his curatorium. Zapsel was present, Bing was absent. He entitled his talk Vom Arsenal zum Laboratorium, from the arsenal to the laboratory. It speaks more clearly than any other document to Warburg's concerns with the political and biological dimension of his experiments, the Vorversuchen. Of course, the weapons of this arsenal were to be his books, but the military metaphor was no mistake. The arsenal, he noted, would also serve as a Beobachtungsdrehturm, and the notion that it would develop into observe observational revolving tower. And the notion that it would develop into a laboratory replete with experiments was already present in the extraordinary peroration of the essay on the relations between superstition and science in the culture of the Reformation. This, as we have seen, was the essay that arose out of the political crises provoked by Italy's alliance with Britain in 1915, and he realized the implications of what he was writing for European politics. Nothing could have been further from Warburg's wine, as Nicholas Barker once put it, than disinterested scholarship. His work was however rooted in the past, was incessantly and necessarily oriented towards the present. The Luther essay is specifically described as a Vorversuch, a pre-experiment on terrain which was still not properly arable. Then, slightly losing his patience, he said, "May the history of art and the study of religion, between which lies nothing at present besides wasteland, overgrown with verbiage, meet together one day at a common work table in the laboratory of the cultural theoretical history of images, im Laboratorium Kulturwissenschaftlicher Bildgeschichte." Here, finally, it would be possible to realize that these images and words, just a fraction of what could have been used, can be regarded as hitherto unread records of the tragic history of freedom of thought in modern Europe. In the course of his talk to the select curatorium, Warburg gave a moving account of his philological and literary education, but he also referred affectionately to his high school botanical studies. Das einzige Fach, das ich jemals ein Eins erhielt, the only subject in which I got an A at the time. After describing his efforts at new readings of Lessing and Winckelmann, he again mentioned Darwin's expression of the emotions and his own efforts to understand the Urwörter leidenschaftlicher Gebärdensprache, the primal words of the expression of the language of the expression of emotions through gesture. But in the late and incomplete introduction to the Bilder Atlas, Warburg returned again to botany, referring to the hedonistic aesthetes from whom he had so firmly sought to detach himself. He took a swipe at those who were only satisfied with the most odorous and beautiful plants. This, he insisted with Goethe, would never lead to a botanical physiology that can explain the rising of the sap, for this will only yield its secrets to show who examine life in its subterranean roots. No wonder that for the new science of images he would need a lab. In it he would bring Kulturwissenschaft to its naturwissenschaftliches ideal. He would make the link. Ulrich Ralph has rightly noted that when Warburg and Cassirer set about establishing a Kulturwissenschaft, cultural history and theory, out of the doctrine of the movement of human movement, he noted that you must not only do this through looking at the past. Both have reached a common meeting point in trying to achieve a contemporarily oriented understanding of their theoretical work. Politics here converged with biology. The past became entirely present in both. Remember the carefully defined track on which Warburg alone set off. The conditions laid down by the nature of the human or man, the mimic. Long before the discovery of mirror neurons and current theories of embodied simulation, Warburg fully realized how critical the role of the imitation and the felt simulation of the actions and gestures of others was to the understanding of the key problem of empathy as a clue to the transmission of pathos formulae across history. One can bet that one of the things that he would have studied in his laboratory in the course of using the observational tools of the Drehturm, this revolving tower usually sat on top of the tanks, was the problem of empathy. To be a good mimic requires good empathy, and this empathy, as I repeatedly written, is not to be conceived in the broad and banal way it is today, but in terms of the motor dimensions, as Warburg insisted. He anticipated the intimate link between visual and motor activity in the brain that now plays such a large role in the cognitive neurosciences. His work is thoroughly imbued with the implications of the implied movement of still images. He clearly sees not just to the core of the problem of the relationship between movement and expression of emotion, but also to its role in the transmission of cultural forms and in their accessibility across borders. Both the misunderstandings to which they give rise and the resolution of the tensions implicit in them. Warburg gives us the historical tools to better understand the scientific mechanics of empathetic engagement with both representation and reality. The scientist in the lab must now begin to put together the material to better understand the enabling of detachment from instantaneity. So I'm going to just now briefly tell you, see if I can do this in 4 minutes, what really seems to me to lie at the core of Warburg's concerns, and that are concerns that face us today. Indeed, 3 months before his death, in his last public appearance, Warburg gave a lecture to a small group of graduating doctoral students in Hamburg. In it, he spoke of the need to understand the dialectical process, the struggle between what in the end are religious concreteness and scientific abstraction, and to establish a receiving station in Northern Europe that registered the give and take between the past and the present. It would thus assist us in containing the chaos of unreason by means of a filter system of retrospective reflection and sophrosyne. A filter system of retrospective reflection and reason and reflection, here translated from Retrospektive Besonnenheit. This then was the receiving station of those routes of exchange between past and present, at which the train from the Lehrter Bahnhof finally arrived. The task was more urgent than even he could have realized. All the fields were imbricated. The ultimate convergence was clear. The links, so often emphasized by Warburg, here too were astonishing. And the final issue was that of Denkraum, the space for contemplation, or more precisely, what he finally called the Denkraum der Besonnenheit. Now, as people have pointed out to me, the German speakers have pointed out to me, Besonnenheit is not a word with which one daily goes about. But it's a very important term for all of us who work with Warburg and all of us who work with the abundance of images that we have before us in our time. The abundance of images that flood us, with which we become instantly engaged. You will remember that Warburg, at the end of his essay on the serpent ritual, said, telephone and telegraph destroy the cosmos. He was concerned throughout about the speed with which we absorb the images around us, the speed with which we absorb information without reflection. So for him, what remained the final problem was a kind of detachment from that speed, and to acquire not only a space for contemplation, but also a kind of self-awareness of what you are doing when you are engaging with cultural objects. He required a kind of detachment from the investigator, a withdrawal from immediate absorption, because he realized even then that the issue was the seductiveness of images and the seductiveness of the emotions with which the images were presented. He remained with this problem. The tension was you get drawn in, but you lose your ability to reflect. You lose your ability to be consciously aware of yourself as a judging subject. The moves from representation in figurative terms to cultural history and then on to politics and biology are clear. I want to just make one acknowledgement of a colleague of mine in the Wildervaartzeuger group. As Christa Johnson has pointed out, the notion of withdrawal to a plane of reflection is conveyed by Bruno's notion of synderesis, as set out in the astonishing late work to which Warburg dedicated himself in Rome in 2829, the Spaccio della Bestia Trionfante, the expulsion of the triumphant beast. In other words, the chasing of the old images from the heavens. We are back to Warburgian arcanity, it seems. Yesterday afternoon, Casero was here. He heard about our Bruno journey with clear inner agreement, and he went along with a keyword, and indeed with Shakespeare. What more could we want? Heil Gott im Detail, he said. So he drew this astonishing conclusion from these detailed studies of Bruno's throwing out of the beast from the heavens. The monster is back, but we can only get to the sphere through it. All our cultures are embedded with a desire for instant engagement with speed. Only through resistance and detachment from the lures of instantaneous forms of pathos can we find the space for Besonnenheit, for reflection and contemplation. So one of the interesting citations which he makes at the end, he quotes Goethe's Sprüche in Prosa, sayings in prose, which he had cited in the Sassetti essay. It is said that the truth lies in the middle between two opposing opinions. Not at all. The problem lies in between, in the unseeable, the ever-active life thought through in peace. It's a wonderful Sprüche of Goethe's, which I don't read out to you in German. Simply to take refuge in the middle is to be blind to the opposing forces of energy, and in the end to the relationship between movement and contemplation. One must struggle between them. One cannot step away from the responsibility to reconcile the unseeable with the ever-active life that is made available for contemplation, or the humanities will become even more irrelevant than they are already. It's in this encouragement to consider what happens in between engagement and the space for reflection, between the duality of passionate engagement and the highest degree of detached reflection, between passionate engagement and the deepest reflection, leidenschaftliche Ergriffenheit und höchste Besonnenheit, as Warburg himself put it in his final reflections on Shakespeare. He didn't reflect on Shakespeare much, but there is that need to reflect on after passionate engagement. It's in these words that the great Warburgian tensions bear their fruit and offer the best hope for the future of the humanities. Thank you.